My name is Jeffrey Weiss. I'm curator and head of modern and contemporary art here at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And I'm the organizing curator of the exhibition Jasper Johns, An Allegory of Painting, 1955 to 1965, where I'm standing now. The exhibition was organized by me to be deliberately interpretive in a way. It is not a retrospective or a survey of Johns' work. Instead, it represents the first 10 years through a focused examination of specific bodies of work within that period of time. And they are structured around four motifs that Johns used separately and together throughout this period. The target, the mechanical device, which is a compass-like scraping instrument that Johns called a device, the stenciled naming of colors, and the imprint of the body. Johns belongs to a transitional generation in American painting. He follows the abstract expressionists very closely, Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko, Newman, Franz Kline, and the others. Those artists had left a kind of example, towering example for artists of Johns' generation relating to the apotheosis of large-scale abstract painting. It was a very difficult example to follow, and of course, after the Great Divide of World War II and the crisis, the world historical crisis of the war in relation to the future of society and of culture, artists of Johns' generation began to question painting that came before them. They were looking for ways in which to dig themselves out, in a way, of the values that were associated with the old world, the world that existed before the war. And they were asking whether or not painting itself was even viable anymore. What is the future of art is a big question, I think, that was on the minds of a lot of figures during this period of time. Johns, in particular, I think, asked that question with great acuity, with great specificity. And in this exhibition, I try to grapple with that aspect of his work, the way in which the work is an interrogation of the viability and the meaning of art, the potential for the future of art, and the way in which Johns himself developed through process, through procedures, over time, across this 10-year period, the way in which he developed a philosophy of art, of the potential of art, which he repositioned. And the fact that Johns proceeded in this way during this period of time made him an essential figure for artists who followed him. We're standing in the first two rooms of the exhibition, and they're filled with nothing but target paintings and drawings that Johns produced between 1955 and 1959, when he abandoned the target as an image. The target is the first motif or image in the exhibition, and it's an important one, partly because it falls somewhere between abstraction and representation for Johns. A target is an actual thing out in the world, a sign that has meaning. It's almost a kind of object that we're familiar with, and of course we know what it references, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it's also easy to mistake a target for an abstract image, an abstract shape, the geometry of the concentric bands. And the fact that the target is both a recognizable thing and an abstract thing makes it ambiguous for Johns, I think, in a useful way. That's what allowed the target to become something else in Johns' work, which it will do, and we'll see that later in the exhibition, when the target leads to Johns' use of the mechanical device. But the target is also important for Johns because it is an image that references vision or sight. It's an instrument for seeing across space, seeing from far away and focusing on a single point. And that, of course, is part of a larger thematics of vision that we'll see throughout the exhibition as well, and one that I think would be especially interesting obviously to a visual artist. So I believe that the target means many things for Johns, and all of them are built into his use of the target, the way that he applies the target to his work. Johns produced during this period of time about 25 targets. We have most of them here in the exhibition, and already I think that shows Johns differently than he has been shown before, because in most exhibitions of his work you'll see 2 or 3 or 4 targets, not the whole series. By showing the whole series, we're trying to emphasize a quality of fixation. States of attention in Johns' work is also a very important subject, and as we'll also discuss later in the exhibition. But this idea of focus and of repetition actually goes back, I think, to the significance of the target. So once again, even the fact that Johns creates a series of targets, that the target proliferates as an image in his work, is attached to this idea of the significance of the target as an instrument for seeing. Interestingly, it seems to me, Johns produced 2 kinds of targets, one with contrasting bands of blue and yellow, which are easy to see from far away. In other words, those target paintings with blue and yellow bands function almost as if we're looking at a real or actual target. You could shoot at this painting from a great distance. You could at least look at it from 100 feet and find the center point and focus on it the way you would with a real target. But Johns also produced monochromatic targets during this period in white, gray, and green. And those pictures are, I think, fascinating because in that context, the target begins to disappear. And when you think of an instrument for seeing through space becoming invisible before your eyes, I think you're talking about something that has a whole other level of significance, something quite haunting, in fact. The monochromatic targets can't be read as targets from far away. They can only be understood as targets from up close. And I think that in turn implicates a whole other state of attention. We move in Johns from focused seeing from far away to scanning a picture up close as if it's as much a topographical map as anything else. These are targets, the monochrome targets, that you can almost feel your way across with your fingertips. In 1962, Leo Steinberg, writing about Johns at a very early date, described Johns working as if he were producing a painting for a blind man. And I think that's a very useful remark in reference to the idea that the target, the monochrome target, becomes something you see only from up close, and in fact that you are virtually invited to see through touch instead of through your eye. That is the move from the concentric bands that are contrasting in the manner of a real target to the monochrome is perhaps to be understood as a move from vision to touch. And this progress from vision to touch is something else that comes up in the exhibition. I think it's an important aspect of Johns' work during this period. Steinberg's reference has to do with the way that the monochrome targets, such as the white target behind me, is built up with collage elements and paint with encaustic, which is a kind of wax, which makes the paint stiffen and dry in a very textured fashion. In fact, the painting does invite you to scan it up close, as I was saying, and almost to touch it. There are a couple of other works in this room that include plaster casts of faces and of body parts, and I think this also is relevant to the subject that I'm discussing, because the plaster casts of faces are cut off at the eyes, and that, of course, goes to the notion of blindness and of sight. And the body parts, I think, are relevant to the idea of Johns' work as something that you touch. We're standing now in galleries that are filled with paintings that show the stenciled naming of colors, red, yellow, and blue. This is the second motif in the exhibition. And the stencil is extremely interesting because it is a continuation, so to speak, of the mechanical activity or the mechanical procedure that Johns used to produce the target. And we'll talk about that too when we come to the device. Johns is working during this period of time with operations or procedures or techniques that are rote or mechanical, that try very hard to bracket or eliminate the use of the artist's hand or the sign of the hand according to the conventions of painting and drawing, in which the hand reflects the artist's touch, in which the hand reflects taste or choice, and in which those things in turn are said to reveal the inner psyche of the artist, subjective states of mind. These are all things that painting was said to mean in the past, and Johns is trying very hard to step away from those conventions and invent a new manner of proceeding in the studio. So the stencil as a mechanical operation is important in that respect. It's also the case that Johns, in naming colors, I think is addressing the history of color in painting in a very interesting way, in a radical way during this period of time that has to do to a degree with language theory, the philosophy of language at mid-century, and the questions that philosophers were asking about the viability of language, about whether or not language can be trusted to communicate in the way that we assume that it does when we use it, either in spoken language or written language. Johns' use of stencils then is specifically relevant to the idea that the words he's stenciling into the picture do name these colors, and these are colors that he's also using, and he's drawing attention to the difference between the actual color in the picture and the word that we use to reference color when we speak in language, and how language to this extent is a kind of arbitrary thing. What do we mean when we say red? What kind of red are we thinking? Does everybody in the room who hears that word spoken think of the same color? Can it be trusted to communicate in a reliable way? Johns also draws attention to this problem in language by stenciling colors using other colors. So blue will appear as red in the picture, or the word white will occur in red or orange, and so on. This kind of thing goes on throughout Johns' work during this period, and it's a way in which he draws language into the realm of concerns that he's addressing during this period in relation specifically to painting and drawing. The paintings in this room belong to the device series. The device is a mechanical scraping instrument, and it's derived from the compass that Johns used to produce the targets. So you already see a relationship just in that fact between the targets and the device. The target paintings, in a way, become the device paintings. Literally, the device is, and Johns called it this, is a slat of wood. It can be either a ruler or a stretcher bar from the back of a painting. And it's used to inscribe a circle or to scrape paint in a big arc in the picture. The mechanical movement of the device is important because, again, this notion of Johns trying to eliminate the old conventions of the artist's hand finds him looking for ways in which to move paint, so to speak, in a quasi-mechanical fashion. So the device is very important, in fact. It seems very simple on the one hand, but it leads us to many things, like everything in Johns' work during this period of time. You can see in the paintings behind me how the device creates a circular scrape of paint, and you can also see how Johns labels that movement, that procedure, with the word scrape and with arrows. This happens throughout the device pictures during this period of time. In fact, the exhibition shows almost every painting and drawing and print from this period using the device. It's another premise of the show that once we establish the motifs around which the exhibition is structured, we need to assemble all of the works that are relevant to that motif, and we've done that here, especially in this particular room. The device paintings also show you that Johns is beginning to combine the motifs. The fact that he uses the four motifs in the exhibition together in various works is very important because it told me that those motifs belong to a constellation, that they have meaning together for Johns. And in this case, we're looking at device paintings that also have the structure of the red, yellow, blue paintings, the horizontal bands that we saw with the red, yellow, blue paintings, as well as the stenciled color names. Again, red, yellow, and blue do appear in both of these works, and in fact in all of the works in the exhibition that include the device. So it's kind of a fascinating combination of those two things. When we speak of the move from sight or vision to touch, there's no better demonstration of that in the exhibition than the group of skin drawings that Johns produced in 1962. These drawings consist of nothing more than Johns's imprint, than the imprint or trace of his hands and his face. And with that, we come to the fourth motif in the exhibition, which is the imprint of the body. The skin drawings were made in a very peculiar way. Johns oiled his face and his head and his hands, and then he imprinted himself across a sheet of paper by rolling his head literally across the sheet, which was tacked to the wall, and then imprinting his hands. He went back with charcoal and with strokes that are a lot like the idea of the device, mechanical strokes that occur in arcs. He left the charcoal mark on the sheet, and the charcoal was saturated differently in the oil trace than it was on the paper, and that made the impression of the face and the hands come through. These works are produced then in a solely mechanical or quasi-mechanical fashion. There's no depiction or representation in the conventional sense. Johns is creating an image of his face and hands strictly by imprinting himself in the manner of a stamp or a seal. And that goes back to the idea of the mechanical nature of all of the motifs in the exhibition: the target, the scraping device, the stenciling of words, and the imprint of the body. But I think when we talk about mechanical procedures in relation to the body, we've come to a whole different place in Johns' work during this period, because Johns has managed, in this case, to retrieve figuration, something that he had abandoned and that most artists during this period had also left behind. He's managed to bring figuration back into the work solely through these concrete, objective, or mechanical means. But at the same time, the expressive power of the figure has also come back into the realm of his work, and that, I think, is a dramatic shift. That is what will bring us to the works that culminate the exhibition, including Diver, the large drawing that Johns made around this time, in which he has diagrammed or inscribed his entire body, including the extension of his arms, in the way that we saw in works like Periscope, Heart Crane, where Johns has attached the palm print of his hand to the slat-like device. He's made himself into a mechanical instrument, in a manner of speaking, and I think that hybridization of the mechanical device and the figure of Johns and of his body has its own expressive power that attains a kind of new level of significance, because at that point I think we can say that Johns is actually looking to a certain degree at the history of a certain kind of image in Western art, and specifically in sacred art, and that is the crucifixion. The extent to which Diver invokes the crucifixion, even as Johns derived the diver figure or the word diver from the poems of Heart Crane. It's all very kind of complex and dense, but the extent to which Diver brings to mind that image of the crucifixion is one measure of how far we've come at the expressive potential of Johns' work during this period of time.